Hi everyone. Welcome. That is the wrong slide. Let's start where we should start. Um, Welcome to everyone. I do hope everything's like working and not lagging and things like that. Um, yeah. This topic is, I think it's gonna be fun. I'm looking forward to it most of the lectures I do, even though I usually look forward to my lectures. And it was surprisingly easy to prepare. Like, usually I have to think about topics a lot, which is fine. I like thinking about topics, but this one just like it feels like the lecture prepared itself. Like I thought of the topic and then the example just jumped out at me, which is really nice. It's like it feels like a relevant topic to cover or something like that. Sounds good, good, lovely. Um, Yeah, and the general pitch is that as as it says on the slide, we think in stories, not in moves. Like if you see, look at an AI or something. Like you have all of you have Lizzie on your computer. Some of you use it more than you should, but that's aside the point. Um, and you see like the computer, it shows its moves, it shows its win percentages. It doesn't have a thought process. It just has these outputs. And we aren't like that. We don't just think in terms of moves and analyze them and output a win percentage. We tell stories about the game. We have ways of representing the information in the game. And I want to show some particularly funny examples of this. Not funny in the sense of the like amusing, more in the these struck me. These were interesting to me. Um, and I want to start by giving a certain example from a student of mine from ages ago. Like this was one of my first students. I worked with them for like a while, and we don't work together anymore. And lecture title here is off. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I didn't change it. Wait, lecture title here is off. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I will change that. Properties. That was my last lecture, which you can go watch on YouTube if you like. But after you watch this one, um, yes. Uh, 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 Controlling the narrative. That's a nice nick. Go of 10. Yes, we don't know if he goes often or if it's go of 10. Who knows? Okay, so now that we have a good lecture title, uh, I want to start this example with my student. Um, you know this position. Like a lot of you know this. Um, and my student every game would play this sequence as black every game. Like like all of the KGS games that they sent me, every game just this happens because it does. Uh, Hello, oh Doctor Leadfoot, Leadfoot. I like that name. Welcome. So and this isn't like a big mistake. It's not really bad, but and this like they do this like really early in the game. Like I don't know, some this, and then their opponent plays here, and they kick and do, and Hane and connect. Whether black has a stone at A or not. And I asked them, why are you doing this? Like, I mean, I didn't ask it like that, but I'm just curious. Like, why do you always play this sequence? Like, it's not like it's bad, but why are you doing it? And what they said to me was, I really hate getting invaded. The example is more poignant with this stone being here, which it usually was. Um, they said, I hate getting invaded. I hate when black plays here and takes my corner. I don't like that. Because it was my corner and no, it isn't. I added that part, but everything else, I'm just quoting them. Okay, it's pronounced like the heavy metal. Nice. I see some like old people catching up in chat. Enjoy. Yeah. Back to this example. This strikes me, and the part that strikes me about it is that my student saw this corner as belonging to them, and they're willing to do a lot of things in order to keep that corner. I hate getting invaded too. Yeah, we all hate getting invaded. And in fact, I made a lecture, I think over a year ago on this channel called Invasions and Their Trade-Offs. And I talked about this phenomenon that when people have something that they think is theirs, they really don't like it being taken away. I love getting invaded. Yes, the stronger you get, the more you like getting invaded. Oh man, I just thought of an example that's so good. And I didn't include it in the lecture, and I'd have to go find it. So I guess I won't, but I'm really sad I didn't include it now, because it was a great example of this. Wasn't it emotional attachments? Oh yeah, Siku makes, yes. I mean, I had both. I had both a lecture on invasions and their trade-offs and on emotional attachments. I have a lot of lectures. But yes, one of the emotional attachments people develop is to their territory. Yeah. I must see this lecture. Go ahead. There's lots of lectures on the NGD channel. Yes. So people develop this attachment to their territories. Like more like another like corollary of this is that people like taking away the territory that they think belongs to their opponent. They also really love that part. So for example, what's something that people have done before that I've seen? Like this, and some of you will know it's not in fashion now, but it used to be in fashion. You can sometimes peep at Q2 as an asking move, and if your opponent plays P3, you can actually hane and live in the corner like this. It's possible. You can't really be killed. And this is a fascinating theme, narratives. Yes, I intend to develop on that, Zephodius. Often in pro games, like maybe like up to 5 years ago, people would ask this question at Q2 and ask, are you going to let me live later or not? And then black says no, and then white can play this move. Or black says yes, and then later, keyword later, white gets to play R3. And I loved playing this as white. I was like, I'm taking my opponent's corner. Yes! I have achieved my objective in life. I got really happy about taking people's corners. The basic example here is people grow emotionally attached and enjoy having their territory, and that's important for them. And this is a common thing that happens. This is my first example. Q mentality, maybe. Yes. Second example, and let me find it. Was it this game? I think it's this game, right? Yes. So this is another student that I've worked with, and I was really like, I'm really happy that I'm pretty like diligent about my accounting. Like I have my students' games in files for like ordered by date and stuff like that, and the lessons ordered by date. And I was able to find this SGF from like 2 years ago, and use it because I just remembered this, and it was like so amazing. So my my student is probably around 15Q. I mean, I don't know what level they are now, but they used to be about 15Q. Or perhaps a bit weaker. They were beginner, though they were improving. And they are black here. And I remember looking at this SGF and seeing white played here. And I thought, okay, so black plays here now. Except black didn't play here. Black played here. And this is not good. um this is a gaping hole in White's territory that's like super super big. Like, you have to do this, and like it's really big. And I thought, okay, this is worth looking at. I can talk to my student about the importance of keeping your stones connected, and how having two separate groups is makes it difficult to handle, and how that's really valuable, and how the side of the board is really important for points as well. Like, this is just really good, and getting to separate your stones like this is like really good. So I thought, great, let's prepare a lesson around this type of thing. And I had like other examples. And I remember asking the student, yeah, this position was interesting. What were you thinking? Like, what was your thought process? And they started telling me about how they wanted to play here because they wanted White to run out somehow with these stones and attack these stones and kill them somehow. And this is why like this whole story started happening, where like they basically sold me this grand plan they had of building the center, like huge center. And I was like, well, what about this move? um and this move wasn't that appealing to them because they were busy building their center. And I thought this was very interesting. That's my next example. So this is in terms of control, like in terms of the narrative in my student's head is, I am building this center, and everything else is not important right now. Only one thing in life is important. The rest doesn't even exist. This is something that can happen. Yes. Okay. Tunnel vision. There are no points in the center. Yes, that's more true than it isn't true. But it's not. I'm gonna call that like 70% true, if there is such a thing. Okay, so these are some of my examples, and I think now I'll go back to the slides and talk a little bit more about what I want to do with this lecture, like why I think this is important, and like how I want to tackle this. So, yeah, controlling the narrative, the general pattern of us thinking in stories and like telling ourselves stories and like formulating things about the game that don't actually have something to do with the moves. Like, and this happens all the time. Like, for example, say you're playing in a tournament, and like you ask your friend, you play your game, and then your friend also finishes, and then you ask them, how did the game go? They don't tell you the game move for move. They tell you a story. So we do this all the time, for good and bad. And I want to like observe some properties of this. And yeah, first of all, why do we do this at all? Why is this useful? Why do Go players do this? And I think the reason is very simple. It's hard to reason if you don't use words. Like, have you ever tried to make a logical like chain of reasoning, or have you tried to reason something out without using words to express it? It's hard. In fact, I'm realizing this in math because I'm a math student, and I'm getting much more fond of doing math in words than in symbols and like numbers. It's much more comfortable and easy to express and clear. We do this throughout our lives, not limited to Go. It's addressing narrative psychology is a thing. Wait, am I like reinventing is the wrong word, but am I like tangentially like colliding into some like field of psychology that I know nothing about? Um, yeah. One of my recent narratives, I gave her a good scare in the mid game, and then she flattened me. Yeah, yeah. Um, yes, I do math. So words are really good for reasoning. It's hard to reason without them, and we're sort of dependent on them. To a large extent. And I have found this very useful. Like, when I put my this is why talking to people is so important, actually, and why oh Jesus Christ. There's I want to ban a person. Ah! Why can't I ban someone? 1 second, I want to ban this. Yes. I'm too much of a literary person. Okay, thank you, go off 10. Thank you. Yes, I'd forgotten I made you a mod, but that's why I made you a mod. I appreciate it. Okay. So back to the scheduled program. This is why talking to people is so valuable. Like, very often when you talk, you have a problem you're trying to solve, or something you're trying to learn, or something you're trying to figure out. Talking to someone about it is so helpful. They don't even need to know more than you or as much of you about the topic. You just talk to them and formulate it in words, and like, it just like, this happens in programming all the time. For example, you have a bug, you go explain it to someone, and like, you solve it before you finished explaining it. I mean, you're all programmers. Like, okay, like half of you are programmers, I'm guessing, so you know what I mean. Yeah. So words are really, really important. And the thing is that words, in the way that you phrase them and in the way that you express things, implicitly create narratives. Like, you have to create a framing for what you're saying and how you're saying it. Yes, the duck phenomenon, rubber ducks. Um, so that's why we do it. It's very useful. It's very important. There's some ways we can mess it up, and I think that the main way I can summarize this is that narratives only approximate reality. Like, the story you're telling yourself about what's going on the board is only related to what's actually going on the board. And the degree to which they are related is, it doesn't have to be 100%, because if you had a 100% accurate representation in your head, that would be too much. Like, Go is way too complicated. We have to make like abstractions of like what like yeah we have to make abstractions of complicated topics like Go to make sense of them. But we also don't want the model to be too unrealistic, and I think that this is basically what tends to happen to people. That the model strays too far from what's actually real. But yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. Yeah. Yes, a bit more background. I think I've already been using narrative thinking for a while. I just didn't phrase it that way. And what I mean by narrative thinking is, instead of just passively having narratives and them existing as a thing, I think about, well, what is my narrative? Like, how do I think about things, and how can I use that? So if I know what the narrative in my head is, then I can change it, or I can develop it. Or if I have a narrative in my head that's like causing me to make mistakes, I can be aware of it. And yes, yes, the last one's funny. Thank you. It's meant to be. It's the same with questions. Once you formulate a question, you're usually already thinking about an answer. But this could be misleading because you might be asking the wrong question. Yes, basically. Oh, wait. Excuse me 1 second. I have realized something. Yes. I totally forgot to plug my computer in. Which... Okay, there we go. Yes, good. That's why it was so slow. My computer was like being like really slow and sluggish, and that's why. Okay, great. So I don't really understand the correlation between the fact of explaining your thinking to help yourself understand your problems and narratives. I'm confused by that. I'd appreciate if you would reformulate it. Yeah. So thinking in narratives is something we're going to do whether we like it or not. And being aware of it is really important. So when I say control the narrative, don't let it control you, this isn't between you and another player. This is just in your own head. Like, in your own head, the way that you think about the game will lead you to make decisions. And if you're not mindful about that, your narrative will control you instead of the other way around. And therapy go nice. And I think that being aware of what narratives you're making in your head is really useful. And in fact, I think some people before have called Jeff. Jeff has finished 8 dan in the chat. He's my teacher. He's a teacher at the Nordic Go Dojo. Some people have called his teaching Go Therapy before. And I think that there's a reason for that. And the reason is, broadly speaking, he makes a lot of... I think he's very good at getting you to understand how you're thinking in your head and like what the narrative is in your head and to change that. And, you know, he has all of these colorful and like memorable metaphors for how people think and how things are that are just amazing narrative reframings. And I think that that's very valuable in Go. And in fact, that's how I mostly use narratives, especially when I talk to other people and I'm trying to learn Go. It's so useful. It's so useful to think in terms of, this is the story in my head, and this is why this story is like leading me to make mistakes. This is how this type of thinking is leading me to screw up, and how can I think differently? Yes. Additionally, if you ever want to teach Go or teach anything, getting a good model of what people are thinking in their heads and how far it is from reality is really useful. So as a teacher, this is really, really helpful. Cognitive behavior therapy targets changing the narrative related to psyche problems. That sounds quite congruent with my that seems quite congruent with my perception of CBT. Yeah. So the final thing, and this is a little bit harder and less relevant, but it's also more fun, and I will show some examples of this, is that you can mess with other people. So when you play Go and you play your opponent, especially if you know them, and this is particularly relevant to people like me because European Go has like the same 10 top players that never change because we have no new young talent. Like, okay, me, sort of, but like, okay, and all of the good young talent is like locked away in Russia right now. Almost all of it. So it's like the same 10 players. I've known them for ages. They've known me for ages, and we know each other very well. And this leads to a lot of knowledge about each other's narratives, and you can sort of mess with people if you know them well enough. And I'll show some examples of that. That's more for fun. I think it's not the most useful application of controlling narratives. Yeah. So this is the motivation for why this is important. And let's go ahead and look at some examples. I think, yes, let's start with the negative examples. How does narrative thinking go wrong? And yes, examples. First, I'll actually show a neutral example. It's not good or bad, it just happened. And let me find the game in my file. Yes, this is the game. Oh wait, no, this isn't the game. Hold on. Where are you? Wait. Did I upload that SGF at all? No, I didn't. Well, I will now because I know how to find it. So this is a game of mine from a relatively recent tournament against some strong player. And yes, there you are. Yeah. And it's a very short example. So this is another strong European player. And I prepared for this game. And part of my strategy... Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I need to change the slide. Yes. Thank you very much. Yes. Here you go. I think now everything should be visible. Thank you very much for the reminder. So, this is a game. I'm black in this game, and I'm playing against. Actually, you will basically all know him or of him, I guess, if you follow European Go. Artem Kachanovsky. And this is European Championship quarterfinals from this year, and I lost this game. I actually lost it pretty badly. But one funny thing is that I am aware that Artem is a cautious player, let's say, and he's kind of sensitive to being threatened. Like, if you play a move that is aggressive, he will realize it's aggressive. He will read into that, and he will be, and actually sometimes he reacts, like too defensively. I've noticed that a lot. Like he's a very, very cautious player, and this factored into a move I played this game, which made some people watching laugh. I'm aware. Yes. I think it was at this moment, if I remember correctly. I didn't look at the game before doing this lecture. It's a last-minute example. But White has this group. And this group is not very weak at all. It's actually pretty hard to attack. But it's also not, strictly speaking, alive. And I like that. I like having that narrative in the game. That my opponent has to think about the fact that this group isn't totally alive. Even if it's really strong, even if it's like almost fine, I want it to be in the back of his mind. And my thought process was, well, if I pretend I can attack this group, my opponent can always just live like this. Like this group just has so much ice space, it's so hard to attack. I can't really do anything to this group. So I thought, if I want to pretend or insinuate that that this group is weak, then I should probably play this move. Wait, did I do it later? Hold on. I thought I did it now. Okay, I did it later, but the same principle applies. So first I did this fighting stuff, which wasn't good, but that's aside the point. And here I played it, yes. I forgot the timing. I thought I played it earlier. Yeah. So I play K3. And I remember playing K3 and thinking to myself for maybe, I may have spent up to 5 minutes making sure that this move isn't a bad move. Like, it looks so bad. Like, the shape is just rancid after you do this. He answered here. It feels like such a weird exchange to play and just empty triangle and, like, liberty problems. Like, it doesn't look like a good move. So I spent actually quite a long time figuring out what does this do with the aji around here. And I had to read like how this Hanya G5 actually works, and how White's actually dead here. And like I remember reading all of this stuff, and or also thinking about what happens if White runs out here and we fight like this way. Is this okay? Does this wedge of White's work? So I had to think about all of these things, and I ended up concluding, I forget exactly what my thought process was, but I ended up concluding that K3 doesn't, strictly speaking, make my position worse. And then I thought, okay, let's just play here. And yes, apparently this made my teachers laugh. This was funny to them. So this is a very like micro example of me just tilting the narrative in a certain direction and trying to remind my opponent that group isn't alive. Yeah, I mean, I did lose this game, but this wasn't the reason. It seems Ajikeshi. Possibly. Would it be Ajikeshi? I'm not sure what I'm giving up by playing it. Maybe something like this attachment, I think. Probably this is what I'm giving up. The option to attach here later. Yeah. Which I didn't do because it's Gote. Like, let's say that... wait, I remember considering this. And there's actually 2 reasons you might not want to do it. One of them is that it's Gote. Like, White plays here, 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 and you have to defend. But this is fine. I'm fine with taking Gote here. The other one is something like White fights back. Like, White plays here, and then here. And then you can cut the stones off, and then, like, now what? I don't know if this is good. But yeah. But this actually is good for Black, I think. Because White isn't alive. White has to spend a move. Which I like, the reason I thought of this is, like, White plays this, and White gets Sente, and then, like, what did Black gain? But it's not Sente. White has to defend again. So, why didn't I play this move? I'm sure I thought of it. I don't know. Good question. Yeah. If you call it an Ajikeshi, you also need an idea of what it is you're erasing. Well, I erased this. which looks plausibly okay. So that's worth noting for sure. So maybe this was a bad move after all. But anyway, this was the idea, and I played it explicitly thinking about the narrative in my opponent's head, which is why I thought it was a funny example. Okay, so this example was just funny. It's not that I don't want to develop it that much. Yeah. I want to start by giving an example from one of my students' games, and I need to find the game. Yes, this game. So, this is a game a student of mine played recently in a real-life tournament. They're like 2Q, maybe. Yeah, I think they're 2Q now, yes. And yeah, they're black. And I remember like the way we started reviewing this game was I asked them like, what are your thoughts on this? What is your like is there any part of the game that stood out to you that's interesting to you? I do that sometimes when I teach, I guess. I just ask a student like anything particularly interesting to you or something. And something that they mentioned was that they like in terms of the game's progression, they felt bad at this particular point as black. And I was like, why? What's your thought process? I mean, I don't disagree, but I'm like curious. How did you arrive to this? And then they said, I felt weird about this fight because this fight feels like white has an open side, black has an open side, and then white took my open side. White just invaded, and then after we did all of this fighting, it's like white got these moves for free and built the lower side for free, and I didn't get anything. So I didn't think this was like terrible, but it felt bad, and I thought it was probably worse. That's what they said to me. And this fired some neurons in my head. Because one of the things I wanted to talk about this game, because I prepared and I looked at the game and I had my ideas of like what might be useful for my student to look at. One of the things I wanted to look at was this move. So at this point, the game is like, it looks kind of endgamey, where no one has like very, very weak groups or easy to attack groups, and you can understand someone for just going for points. And my student played E1, which is just 4 points in double sente. So white loses these 4 points, whereas counterfactually, white would always end up getting this move in sente, and that's like kind of good for white. Or at least that was my student's thought process, where it's just 4 points in double sente, I should play it urgently. When I reviewed this game, like not with my student, but just when I was preparing the lesson, I thought this was weird, because I was thinking, I want to invade this area. This isn't white's territory yet. There's so much I can do with it. Like, for example, I could throw a stone here. And this is like the kind of classic invasion pattern that you may have seen before. Where, like, here black doesn't have the ladder, but like if you want to, you can still do something like this, and this group won't die. Like, you can think about this kind of thing. And maybe you won't do that sequence specifically. Maybe you'll just shoulder hit and try and do something like this. You have many ways to reduce or harass this white territory. In fact, when my student told me this thing about I was annoyed that white got these 2 moves and got to enclose their territory, like, I connected these 2 things and realized that from my student's perspective, E1 is okay because they've already classified this as white's territory. And I thought this was very interesting. Later, my student played S2, and some of you that are more experienced with this type of shape may be aware that this shape is sort of weak. Like, black can attach here and cause some mayhem. Like, cross-cut type of thing. It's a mess, but it's a good mess for black. And there's a lot of aji here. Instead, my student just played N5, and even after white plays L6, which is leaving like a gaping hole at N4, my student didn't really go for much. My student just played some endgame. And eventually my student lost this in an endgame, just lost like, I think by like 6 points or something. And afterwards, like I still hadn't mentioned to them that this is like, I thought that this move was a mistake. And I asked them like, why, like, what kinds of ideas do you see around N4? Because like we all know that there's Aji there, but like what would you do specifically? What were you thinking of? And then they said, well, I was thinking of this sequence, but then I realized that I'm locally not alive with these stones after white plays J3. So it's a liberty race, and I was scared of this liberty race. That's what they said. And then I said, are you scared now? And then they went like, oh, yeah. Like there was this moment of realization, and then I mentioned how I thought E1 was a mistake. And the basic idea of why E1 is a mistake is that this white territory is not territory. It's extremely invadable and has a lot of weak points. And many times during this game, Black could have used this group. Black could have used this this white influence and like reduced it more aggressively, or even tried to invade. And I think that the reason my student lost this game is that they weren't thinking in those terms. They just saw this white thing that looks like territory and just conceded that it belongs to white and didn't look at it that closely. And yes, I thought this was an interesting example of a narrative being embedded into the game. The moment that my student wasn't happy that white played these moves and that, oh, this belongs to white now, invading this area just didn't cross their mind. And this is an example of where narratives can go wrong. Because when you make a narrative of like, oh, I own this area, my opponent owns this area, this is my influence, I should be able to attack this group, you're kind of simplifying your thought process. Like, if you classify this group as alive, you basically don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to question every move, is this group alive or not? Or if you like classify this as your territory, you don't have to look at this territory for the rest of the game. It like simplifies your model. If you don't think of this white territory as invadable, then you don't have to think about invading it. It makes your thought process much easier to perform. It's easier to it's easier to reduce this territory than to invade it in terms of like mental load. So this narrative is like a simplifying model, which is a good thing. Simplifying Go is really important because Go is really complicated. But in this case, it's really not congruent with reality. It's straying far enough from what's actually the case that it really hurt my students' winning chances, because they're not using a resource which they could be using. And all of this is down to this framing that they had for this being white's territory that belongs to them. And they're analyzing this territory in terms of, how do I reduce it optimally, and not, can I exploit this? Can I exploit these shapes? Could I maybe invade? Could I think about that? I felt that this was a fun example of like the narrative just sort of dictating the course of the game in a way that's unfavorable to the one with the narrative. Eventually this game was just like white kept all of their points, eventually this is where my students stopped recording, and like eventually Black just lost on points. So yeah, that's the conclusion of the type of way this. I think that most of the time when narratives hurt, when they're not a good thing, is when the picture that they give you really doesn't have that much to do with reality. And I'm reminded of a different lecture that I gave you guys 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. What was it? 2 weeks ago or a month ago? I forget. I think it was a month ago. I did another lecture on that, which I called "Mistakes Not Worth Thinking About," and I talked about the basic TLDR of that lecture is, when we make mistakes, um like when we lose a game 3 weeks ago, maybe, yeah. When we make mistakes, it's very easy to pin this mistake. Not mistakes. When you lose a game, it's easy to pin the loss on a mistake. Um, so, and on a single mistake, you lose a game and you're like, oh, I missed that Tetsuji. I died with this group, and like you have this one scapegoat, this one reason you lost. And this is a simplification of the model because the game didn't last that one move. The game lasted lots of moves, and you made lots of mistakes. You're just choosing that one. And sometimes this is helpful, and sometimes this isn't. And I made the case in my last lecture that that most of the time, when you scapegoat one mistake for your loss, it's a mistake. It's not. It's a mistake. Usually multiple mistakes, or maybe one mistake, but one mistake that keeps applying itself over and over again in different positions and in different ways, causes you to lose. And people tend to simplify the model of what they lost quite a lot, and I think it's a mistake. In the old days, we used the word paradigm. So in order to get stronger, you need to change your paradigm. It's called the paradigm shift. I think that makes sense. You can think of, like, I have an idea of paradigm as basically the entirety of your like model, your worldview, and you do need to change it if you want to improve. I agree with that. I think it's also important to realize which parts of it are helping you, though. Like, I've had this is slightly painful to admit, but I think I have given my students advice and like offered them paradigm shifts, which at least in the short term gave them worse results and like made them play worse. Like, I don't think I've like actually damaged the student where they actively play worse over the long term, but I have given them advice where the way that I encourage them to think caused them to lose more in the short term, which is a painful mistake to make as a teacher. So it's not like all paradigm shifts are good, but probably all good things are paradigm shifts. Which, yeah, is interesting to think about as a teacher. I don't choose my mistakes choose me. Yeah. So, but I think it's a good to like at least identify what your mistakes are, like, accurately, let's say. It's a really useful skill to have. Yeah, so yeah, that lecture was like one of the last ones on the Nordic Godo channel, Nordic Godojo channel. It's like kind of related to this one, so yeah, if you're enjoying this, you might want to watch that one or something later. Not every change is an improvement, but every improvement is a change. Yeah, that's fair. I think that's basically the point I'm getting to. Okay, next example. I want to show my least favorite example of like narratives, or like one of my least favorite narratives in Go that's very pervasive. A lot of people think like this, and I hate it. I mean, you don't have to hate it, but I do. Wait, let's find you. I have an unusual amount of files this game, and was it this game? Wait, this game shouldn't be here. Oh, this game should be here. Excuse me. Yes, this is the game. Yes, fixed ideas too limited. Paradigm is like a web of knowledge. Yeah, but I think the important part about a paradigm is that the web of knowledge, like, forms into something. It's not just a like randomly the pieces of knowledge aren't disconnected. They have something that connects them and that like builds them into something. But yeah, I generally agree. It reminds me of the part in Hikaru no Go where he always plays against Sai to train, but then gets scared of everything and loses his other games too. Yeah. So sometimes you get into I've had students that get into a very defensive narrative. Like, the way that they think is, I want to take care of my groups and save my groups. And I'm and this is good and bad because you don't die, but you also sometimes don't play good moves. So yeah, some narratives you can build are unhelpful, let's say. And the narratives, importantly, the narratives aren't just random. They happen from your experiences. Like, you can influence them by changing your experience or talking to people, or like getting teachers is an extreme example of this because it drains some of your resources, but whatever, you can do that. And there's ways you can change your narratives. You don't just observe them passively. That's why I'm doing this lecture. You can influence how you think, to a large extent. Yeah. Or punishing narrative. My opponent is necessarily worse than I am. I have to teach them how their moves are bad. Yeah. I've done that before in like tournament games and stuff, and it's not helpful. Yes. Sucking at tactics makes you choose wrong narratives that stronger players wouldn't fall into. I understand what you mean. So certainly your ability to get a good model of what's going on the board is somewhat dependent on your ability to calculate. That is correct, yes. On the other hand, I think the point that Zogi might be missing, or like the point that I would make that he hasn't, is that your skill at reading is largely influenced by how you're thinking about what you're reading. Like, I remember when I was much younger, and I played, like, I thought that my reading was like my biggest asset, which it probably was. I've always been quite good at reading. And when I would read some sequence, I was like, oh my god, I'm so good. I can read so far ahead. I can see so much. Nice. I'm a good Go player. And I'd read this 20 move sequence. I've told this story many times before. Then I play the move, leads to this 20 move sequence, and my opponent like Tenukis or something. And this hadn't even crossed my mind that this could possibly happen. It just isn't in my mind that this is like a thing that occurs. And I think a lot of, and I think I've actually done like lectures on reading and what my thoughts on reading are. So a lot of the reading you do, like what you read and how you read it, is determined by how you think about how you build your models of the board. So these are related to each other. They're not independent. So when you say your reading hurts your narratives also hurt your reading. So they're related. Anyway, this game is a painful game, and it's also... Actually, this game has a funny story behind it, which I'll tell at the end. The spoiler is that this game is the most lucrative game of Go I have ever played. It earned me more money than any like other game of Go that I've ever played. In fact, it has earned me more per time spent than anything I've ever done related to Go. But we'll get to why in a second. This game was played at the World Amateur Go Championship in 2018. I was 5 dan. I'd had a pretty bad tournament, and so far, and I played this 4 dan from Malaysia, who I actually knew. I knew him from I'd gone to Malaysia before, and I knew him. And I'm white, and this will be very weird because I've changed a lot as a player in the last 4.5 years. So I can, yeah, that's interesting for me to see. But the game itself isn't that important for a really, really long time. Yeah, this is sort of funny. I like S10 is my invasion move, and then I try to make life in here, and it turns into a huge mess. But whatever. I don't want to talk too much about the details of the game because this part isn't important. Yeah, it's just funny to look at afterwards. Oh my god, and we started this Ko. I'd forgotten how wild this game was. And I make the Ko bigger. This is a brave move. What? Why don't I just take? It's so big. Okay, anyway, I'm confused. Whatever. This is... I don't vouch for my past self. Oh yeah, and eventually... Oh, that's the reason I started. I start the Ko... Okay. Because I know I have this one big threat and I want the corner. And then black gets a huge influence and game continues. Why nobody cuts at 013? That's also a fantastic question. I don't know. I'm not here to defend like 4.5 years ago old me. But yes. So the point here, yes, this. And actually, I have 2 stories about this game. So Jeff was in the chat earlier. He's a Go teacher. He's my teacher, and he's absolutely fantastic. And we started working together about 3.5 years ago. And when we started working, he told me to send him a bunch of my SGFs, just like all of the games I have. that like all of the games I have that I've played, that I have records of, and I sent him, among other things, this game. And the first lesson we ever had, he showed me this game and showed me this position. And I at first I asked a question, and then I played F13. And the idea behind this move is that I have some area of influence, and I want to keep that area of influence because it's mine. We've talked about this before. Earlier this lecture, we covered exactly this type of example, where I have something that's mine and I want to keep it. In fact, when my opponent played here, he was very, very likely insinuating that territory is yours and I'm going to take it from you. So I defend it. And that feels like a natural thing to do, but it avoids the, in retrospect, obvious point that F13 isn't the biggest move on the board, which seems very like obvious in retrospect. Like, imagine looking at this position without knowing what the last move was. I think the instinct is actually to play something like h3, because we all know that there's no points in the center. Like, we've all been told that a million times, and it's correct. And White's very strong here. White doesn't have weaknesses. Like, White has nothing to defend, and the center is just air. So what I should be doing is playing h3, or maybe, I mean, if I'm feeling aggressive, I could play c11, because later I can cut at f5 and the black group is cut or something. I mean, I don't endorse that, but that's better than what I did. No points in the center. Got it. Yes. So, but my narrative was, I want to defend my points. The other thing that happened is that I understand that I am better this game. I know that I am ahead. So, and this also influenced my thought process, where, and I used to do this a lot, and in fact, this is the type of narrative I want to, like, warn about. When you're ahead, when people are ahead, they very, very frequently do this thing where they say, oh, I'm winning, I want to keep winning. And if I'm winning and I do something complicated and hard and, like, dangerous, then I might lose, so I should play safe. And if I let my opponent invade and take my territory, then maybe I might lose, because right now I'm winning and I have more points. This type of thought process happens a lot. And then people, when they're ahead, tend to play safe. They tend to protect their territory, they tend to avoid fights. And I claim that this, more often than not, is a bad habit. And the way that I reframe this is, like, I've had students who, like, absolutely destroy their opponent in, like, the first 100 moves. Like, they win some fight big, they kill something, everyone's happy. Then they spend the rest of the game playing safe, and they lose by half a point. And the question I'd have, like, the narrative you can think about as an alternative is, well, you were crushing your opponent before, why would you stop crushing them now? Like, you were playing better, just keep playing better. And I think that this is actually a much better strategy than getting into the I don't want to lose mode. And in general, I very much encourage that people play to win and not to not lose. And I don't have a particular reason why I think that this is better, other than other than, like, empirically I observe that those who, like, count points, like, for example, people say, oh, it's a skill to count because then you can adjust your play to the score. This is a very risky business. In general, I think, like, there's a time and a place to adjust your play to the score and play safe, but it's such a risky business. And my empirical observation is that out of my students and people I know, it's so much more it's actually safer unintuitively to just play your best go. And this is why counting is overrated, because unless you're, like, absurdly far ahead, where, like, it's stupid, like, where anything you do is fine, I think that playing the best move is better than playing the safe move, like the best in a point maximizing sense. But people don't think like that. This is a very common narrative, and I see a lot of my students, a lot of people use it, and I observe that more often than not, this puts their game in danger. Like, they play safe. Yeah, great following for the last time's lecture. Yes, why counting is crucial. Yeah. I haven't looked at that lecture yet, but I might want to talk to Elion later about this. It's not like counting isn't important, but I do think it's overrated. Yeah. And the adjustments that people make to their play are really big. Like, you can adjust your play, but you shouldn't adjust it much. You should adjust it a little bit. And what I'm doing here is I'm adjusting it a lot. Like, fundamentally, at the time, at the time, I was a very aggressive player. Like, at this point, I was very, very aggressive, and I enjoyed attacking things. So a move like this from me is extremely weird. It's just my, like, what's going on in my head is totally different from what usually goes on in my head. And I was going into like, oh, I'm playing a weaker player because he's 4 done and I'm 5 done, and I should be safe and I should like preserve my points, and I'm just winning. And what normal me would do is probably like play here. I mean, normal me at the time. Current me, I'm not sure, but like normal me would like play here and then play here and be like, this group is weak, don't you see? Which I don't agree with, but that's probably what I would have done at the time in my normal thought process. And I want to show this as an example because this is a game where I played really safe. And I had this narrative in my head of like, oh, let me just close points and protect my points and win. And I got into a lot of trouble because of it. So, yeah. So first of all, notice that my opponent suddenly has a lot of influence and like a lot of potential territory. I would enjoy a show match. Yeah, between old me and new me. I think I've often thought about that. How many stones could I give 2018 me? Yeah, it's a fun thought. Considering that people suck at understanding what safe moves are, isn't it dangerous to count? Potentially, I might agree with that. Yes, safe move is good. Just people have a very poor understanding of what is safe. I think that that's true. Yes. If you redefine safe as a particular thing, then the safest move will be the best, will be what you should do. But you need a different definition of safe than what most people use. You know, Yoda Norimoto is like that. He's phenomenal in the beginning, and he was clearly leading. Kobayashi Satoru was commenting, saying that it didn't really matter how much Yoda was leading because somehow Yoda would always make it close anyway. So this problem is not limited to amateurs. Yes, some professionals also do this. I think the difference is that professionals, the failure rate is much lower with professionals. Like, they will control whether they're actually ahead. Like, the best, like, when you're being cautious and just trying to chill and be safe, the idea is, let me preserve my lead while I'm being safe. And the reason it fails is that people are too busy being safe to realize that they're not leading anymore, or that they're not leading as much as they would be, and that their lead is actually decreasing and that the game is getting less safe. If you have a good, accurate perception of how much of your lead you're trading for safety, then this is a good thing to do. It's just really hard, and I don't recommend you do it. Like, or I don't recommend you assume it's a good thing to play safer because you're ahead. It's a very calculated thing to do, which I've basically only seen really strong players do successfully. I think Shasho is is the person who always searches for a best movie even when he leads. Yeah, Shasho is kind of like that. He's that type of player, and I think players who think like that tend to be good. Like, if you're really, really good, you can also play the safe way accurately, but people who just want to win harder, I think, tend to become better players. It's also good for learning. Like, trying to just play your best all the time is better pedagogically, but that's aside the point. We had a game like that once, didn't we? Did we? I've forgotten, but probably. Like, I think I remember every game that Zephodius and I have ever played, but I don't remember like that we played it, but I don't remember like the game well enough to say. But yeah. Okay. So this particular game, I kept playing safe, and I was like, let's do my end game, and as a result, all of this area that like definitely shouldn't have belonged to black, now belongs to black. Look at it. Look at this enormous, beautiful moyo that just belongs to black that didn't belong to black before. And suddenly my 15-point lead is like very, very small. And I remember still, like, I count a lot. So I was aware of this, but each time the lead slightly decreases, and I'm not worried because I'm still ahead until the lead isn't there anymore. And yeah, so I mean, at the time I wasn't like a complete pushover as a player. I mean, I was a strong player. And like I was actually now needs to do stuff with B18. B18 doesn't work, does it? B18 is just like endgame and also doesn't like even make a co, if I remember correctly. But anyway, this this game is particularly interesting because oh wait, did black should really protect now. Okay, yeah, the black knew. So black played this move, which famously allows white to create a ko in the corner. Maybe even something more if white has a stone at C, I don't know. But then black played all of the center exchanges and then defended. The key point this game is that I was still ahead at this point. I'm just not ahead by 15, I'm ahead by like 2. And I was aware of this, that I'm losing my lead, but I'm also like, I'm playing safe. And I don't want to go into the details because time, but this game I just screwed up, and I also I messed up endgame badly enough, like late endgame, this stage of the game. I messed up this stage of the game badly enough that it actually became a half pointer. So I don't want to go into the endgame mistake, but yeah, the game got really close, and game ends, and my 15-point easy comfortable lead turned into, when we counted that I had won by half a point. Yeah. And this story hasn't ended. This is just, I'll tell this story quickly because it's not part of the lecture, but yeah. Remember how I mentioned that this game got me lots of money? The reason isn't that, oh, I got 3rd place at the WAGC and got lots of money for it. No. After the game, my opponent, like a while after the game, like we submitted the results, etc., and then my opponent came to me later and he said, I just recorded our game until the end, and the computer says that I won by half a point. And I was like, that's interesting. So we went to the referee, we played the whole game out, we counted again, and again, and it turned out that he'd won by half a point instead of me. We had actually successfully miscounted. And I was given a choice by the referee because we'd already counted originally and submitted the original result. I was given the option to not accept that I had lost, like to just keep my win. And I said no. I changed the result and I lost. And at the end, during the prize giving ceremony, I got a fair play award. And this fair play award, which I have no doubt happened, like I got because of this concession, was, if I remember correctly, I might remember incorrectly, but I think I remember correctly, was like 700 euros worth, like 700 euro ghost stones, like really fancy, like yeah, super fancy, like high tech ones, which look very pretty. So like that's like, in terms of like games I've played, this was the most profitable one, which is funny. Yeah, loser takes all. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the story. Also, that tournament was terrible. I lost 25 rating points, and I placed below the 1Q from Luxembourg, and I never heard the end of it from him. That was not a good tournament. I lost to everyone. But yeah. More examples, like actual examples. And now I want to move on to like the positive things. What about the converse, playing riskier moves when you count yourself behind? Is that also dubious? Well, that's actually a good point, because this now I'm going to transition and I'll answer your question, Comorphism, soon. Basically, when you play Go and you are behind, maybe you don't realize it, but you are thinking in narratives. People that fall behind tend to do this thing where they're like, I'm behind, I need to play risky, and I need to like push for stuff. And this can be a really bad thing, because you're going to start playing worse, but there's a specific type of case where it works. And this is when, ironically, when your opponent is playing safe. Think about the combination. One side who's really, really willing to take risks, and one side who's really unwilling to take risks. And this imbalance will basically lead the side that that wants to take risks to get a huge benefit out of each interaction that they have on the board. And I've done this before. Like, I remember playing. I used narratives very successfully in a recent game. I should have shown it. I should have shown. I have other examples, but it's a good example actually. I fell like 20 points behind after like a catastrophic Joseki mistake against Korean 7-Dan. And then at first I chilled, because the game is really long, and like I agree that people can get very impatient and try to recover immediately and things like that. Yeah, so I remember being patient, but I observed that my opponent was playing very safe, and also that he didn't seem to be reading that much. And I put 2 and 2 together, and like little by little, I made my strategy in the game riskier and riskier, and more like aggressive, and got into weirder and weirder fights. And this progression in the game actually led me to win pretty comfortably from a position where I was 20 points down, according to the computer. I didn't think I was that bad, but I thought I was bad. Yeah. One thing that's great with AI and with AI graphs being so easy to get is that you realize that you might think that you're so far behind, but instead you're like 10 points behind in the middle game. Yeah, this is very common. AI is a really good way to check how accurate your narratives were, because sometimes they're just wildly off, and the AI lets you know. This is one of the good ways you can use AI. I think that's helpful. So yeah, that example against the Korean 7-Dan was one way that I used the narrative of the game in my favor, and I set up this dynamic where I'm the one pushing for stuff and my opponent is the one giving me stuff. This is really hard to do, but it can be done. And I think that playing aggressively when you're behind, as a rule, works much better than playing safely when you're ahead. And the reason is that your opponent, like, imagine your opponent plays well and you play risky, your opponent will probably crush you, especially if they were crushing you before. But if then your opponent is like, I need to start being safe now, you might do really well. And this is one of the ways you can, because so far we talked about how narratives in our heads, I give concrete examples of how narratives in your head during a game can harm you and lead you to do badly. And this is basically because it gives you like an inaccurate representation of the game, of what's actually going on. But there's also ways that you can use narratives to help you in various ways. And we've talked a lot about being aware of your opponent's narrative and controlling that, and basically controlling the way that you speak to your opponent and the type of interaction you have. This is extremely hard to do successfully. I don't recommend you try it without giving it some thought first. I failed a lot. Like, when I do specific preparation for an opponent, or I try to play in a certain way to deal with an opponent, I have found that it's really hard to calibrate correctly how you should do it, but it can be done. However, the most important successful use case of narratives is that we have to remember why we use them in the first place. And it's that they're useful abstractions for learning stuff and for explaining stuff and for making things make sense in our head. So it's not like we want to become like AI, like, objective beings that don't think in narratives. We just can't do that. It's impossible. So the point being that if we're going to think in narratives, then we should probably be intentional about it and control which types of narratives we have and realize, well, I'm thinking in this particular way. Is this conducive to me improving? Or is this turning out well for me? And should I change the perspective from which I look at the game? Yeah, Andre plays like that. He plays aggressive if his opponent thinks he is winning and tries to trap his opponent if the opponent thinks he's losing. Yeah, there's some players that really want you to live a narrative. Like there's some players that look at the board more. And there's some players who also live their own narrative. Like they just think about what they think in their head and keeping their group safe and like them being okay. And there's other players that are very, very concerned about what their opponent thinks. And in practice, this like basically looks like it like when you see the output of a player who thinks about what the other person is thinking and tries to control that narrative, they tend to look very aggressive. And Andre looks like an aggressive player. And I think that that's sort of why. How do you know if a narrative is right or wrong, aside from asking AI or a stronger player? Very good question. I think that it's really hard to think in narratives. It's really, really hard to think in narratives successfully if you don't express the narratives in words, like to people. So, when you like, let's say the narratives that you build in your own head are often very inaccurate, and it really helps to express them out loud to another player, and this is the important part, and also show them the game. Like, if my student tells me a story about how their game went, that doesn't really help me. But if they tell me a story and they also show me the game, this is extremely useful. So I think that one thing you can do is like try and express your narratives out loud and see how much sense they make. Like, things you say out loud that you were thinking make a lot less sense when you say them out loud sometimes. Or sometimes they make more. It just helps you to realize how useful your thoughts really are. Yeah. So I think that that's expressing it out loud and expressing it to the other people and getting a second opinion is really important in general. You don't need it to be a stronger player. You can just explain it to whoever. And that's already very helpful. Obviously, getting teachers is helpful for this, so long as they're a good teacher. Yeah. So those are some ways you can do it, but you have to be deliberate. It doesn't just happen by itself, and you have to be deliberate about being aware of what you're thinking in your mind about the game. I don't think this happens on its own. Back to the red duck, yes. Theory of mind is a branch of cognitive science that investigates how we ascribe mental states to other persons and how we use states to explain and predict the actions of those other persons. Most accurately, it's the branch that investigates mind reading or mentalizing. I see. That makes sense. I mean, you can't read someone's mind like a book, but you can certainly guess at what they're thinking, and it can be useful, yes. Importantly, you can guess at what you're thinking, if that makes any sense at all, and evaluate how useful it is. Another way you can think about narratives is, first of all, being aware that you have them, and second of all, you can make an empirical case for how often does this work out for me? Like, the way that I've concluded that playing safe is a bad thing, I don't have like a reason. Like, I don't have a logical reason why this is worse, because it kind of makes sense. But empirically, I have observed that people who do this do badly. So I think it's something about observing what thought patterns are there and which one of them which ones of like between them tend to do well, like which ones lead to good results. So I kind of suggest some degree of empiricism here. Yeah. That's how I do it, at least. And getting second opinions really helps as well. I highly recommend that. Okay, these are actually very similar tips to the tips I gave on my last lecture, which is a related topic. Okay, I'm considering we are actually basically at time. And I had a couple of examples, and I'm not going to do both of them, but I'm wondering if I want to do one of them, because I want to use an example. So far, we've talked a lot about what things can go wrong when you use when you frame your thinking in a certain way, and how it can mislead you. And we haven't looked at examples of how you can use them in good ways, and how they can be helpful. And I actually have examples for that, and it's very important that I don't want to say that having narratives in your head is a bad thing. It's a neutral thing. You just have to use it. So I feel a bit bad leaving the lecture with no examples, and I'm thinking, which one do I use? Oh, I had a very funny one as well. That's unfortunate. Basically, how to improve your positional judgment, which seems to be a very big basis on one's narrative. I think I've seen a couple of comments from you this lecture, Zogi, which to me think you're approaching this from a different direction than I'm approaching it. I'm not thinking of positional judgment. I'm thinking of observing the way I think about things and improving the process whereby I choose which narratives I choose. Yeah, so, yeah. And I think that what you see as positional judgment will improve as a result of that, not the other way around. Like, this is positional judgment, if that makes sense. Okay, I will do one more example before I wrap up. I had more in mind, but whatever. Time. I don't want to be here all day. Because, I don't know, schedules and stuff. So I'll use this one example. This is a game by a student of mine, played at a real-life tournament again, and my student is about 1 done, and we get... Okay, this move is not very good, but that isn't the point here. You mean a narrative is positional judgment? I think positional judgment is a subset of what I'm calling narratives, yes. Okay, so this particular game, so both players are about 1 done, and we get to this position where white plays e17. And e17 is very explicitly starting a fight, because if black plays e16 and just lets white get away with this, then white just shoplifted the entire top side and got like a lot of profit. If black plays c18, then white isn't going to play b18, because why would they do that and let black play f17? This is like white did nothing. So white very probably is going to play something like f18 and try and fight. Or that was, I think that was the plan that white had when white hunted. Spoiler, this is not good for white, because after black hanes and just makes life, then white's dying absolutely everywhere. Looks like EGC game. Yes, this is a game yeah, we've talked about this game, Browser. Browser's my student. Yeah. And this is his game. So this group is just like dying, which isn't good for white. I mean, it's not dead, but it's like... Oh wait, it is dead. I'm blind. I somehow thought white had 4, not 3. Okay, so white's actually dead, and white's not getting anywhere. So white would have to play here, and then like concede. The more exciting version of this, which I think that white possibly wanted to try, is to go down first. Because now, when you do the tombstone shape, black is like less alive. So maybe this is what white had in mind. But you can refute this in various ways. Like, I think... I mean, actually, there's lots of different things you can do that are good. But I think one of them is just connecting, probably like this. This should be okay. So, yeah, I think this should be okay, because even after white plays b18, and so something like this happens, you still have a ko later, which is heavy for white. Like, you have a ko at a18. And another thing you can do is, after white went down at d19, you can play e17, f16. And this is like the last position we looked at. But we've made this exchange, which makes life significantly harder for white in this fight. So maybe what would happen now? It's like I think basically now black just gets a good sacrifice, whereas if these stones weren't there, black wouldn't get a good sacrifice. Like after this exchange, black can, for example, like play here and then play here, and like later all of this is sente. It's not sente now, but it's endgame sente. So okay, there's various ways that black can do well. In the game, black played e16, as I said, black shouldn't have, and just let white get everything. And we talked about this after the game, and the story inside my student's head went something along the lines of, this is really complicated and dangerous, so I don't want to do that, whereas this is within the range of what I consider acceptable and fine. And that's why I play it, because maybe it's not good, but it's acceptable, it's okay. And he was like, I get sente, and like I get to do other stuff, and I don't give up that much, etc. And in my mind, I thought this was a very strange thought process, because yeah, need to update that range, exactly. Because in my opinion, black got scammed here, like really badly. It would already be so much better if after this exchange, like playing the exchange first, because in this case, G18 is sente. White needs to protect. So you're basically getting these two moves for free, which is so much better than the game. So that's one thing you could do. But there's so many things you could do, and basically my student was content, and in my opinion, got scammed. And I thought that in general, one reframing that might have helped my student and might help my student in the future is to perceive when, like from your opponent's perspective, when will your opponent be really, really happy to get this result? Like if your opponent like does this, think about it from your opponent's perspective. Your opponent cuts and starts a fight, and then you just give him everything he wanted to fight for. And if you reframe it that way, you're like, oh my god, I'm getting scammed. I don't want this to happen. I want to fight back. And maybe you look more deeply into fighting here. And maybe you look into this fight and you conclude that this doesn't work. Like, you realize that this fight's bad for black, it doesn't work, and that you have to grin and bear it. But maybe you won't. The point is, I thought it is a good idea to read this out and like be very and be more bullish, be like, I don't want to get scammed, I want to defend myself. He turned off his brain, e.g. he rationalized why reading wasn't necessary. He didn't read ? And the person in question is like, nope, he didn't. Oof. I remember you read a little bit, but not in enough detail, especially given this is European Go Congress time settings, which is, you should probably be spending time to read this. I am an expert at not reading. I agree. I know that person, and I agree. Yeah. And basically, in this case, you can think about the narrative that my opponent had. I keep calling my students my opponents. What a Freudian slip. So my student had this like idea in his head of wanting to simplify the position and wanting to get simple positions or where he perceives that he's okay. And I thought that a more useful narrative that might help my student, even just as a learning exercise, but possibly to have in general, is to look at the game from his opponent's perspective and ask the question, would my opponent just be really happy to see this happen? And then be like, well, maybe I shouldn't give my opponent everything he wants. Like, maybe you should, but maybe you shouldn't. And you should consider that from your opponent's perspective, he's basically scamming you, and that's not good. Of course, sometimes your opponent thinks he's scamming you, and like it's like they're not, like it doesn't work, but or like the scam is actually good for you or whatever. So this analogy doesn't work out perfectly. It's not like you shouldn't give your opponent anything they want just because they want it, but I do think that for my student in particular, reframing things this way, thinking about it from their opponent's perspective, is like a good thing, and might have helped. I have the opposite problem. I try to read too much in my head. So now I try to play faster to avoid reading too much. Yeah, some people definitely overread, which I described earlier this lecture. Like I do that. Okay, so I wanted to get this example in to show how when I teach, I try to understand what the narrative is inside my students' head, and importantly, I try to change that narrative, or like help students change their narratives to something that's helpful to them. And this doesn't mean getting rid of the narrative. This doesn't mean becoming an like objective, non-human, non-wordy bot. I don't want people to do that. I just want you to be aware of, why do I think what I think? Why am I telling myself these stories? And to try and implement ways of realizing, well, how much are these helping me? How helpful are these? How good are these for me? And you can do that empirically. You can look at, do I win often when I think this way? You can maybe observe that you can just observe every time that I play safe, I end up not being safe, and the game ends up being a half-point game, or really complicated, or maybe you can observe that, like, every time that you just think that you're that you will easily invade something because like you think that it's easy to invade, and then you die, and then maybe you can reframe the way you think about influence. That's an example off the top of my head, but there's many ways you can think about the narratives that you're building and try and reframe them in ways that are helpful. And I think that that's the basic premise of this lecture. Parenthetically, I will mention that you can also think about what narratives people have in their heads. And as a teacher, this is basically my job. I have to figure out how you think and help you think in ways that will make you better at Go, because that's what you came to me for usually. So I do this a lot, and it's very useful to me. You can also use it nefariously, e.g. if you're playing an opponent and you want to beat them. But this is much harder. It's, like I said, it's hard to do intentionally. To intentionally shift the narrative in a game with your opponent. I think that controlling the narrative is a principle that applies more to what's going on in your head, and being aware of like, which things do you believe strongly about the game, and like which models do you use often, and which ones work and which ones don't. I think that this is the easier way to use them, and like the more reliable one, let's say. Okay, so that's it. That's the lecture. This is basically what I planned, except for another example, which I won't go into because it'll take another like 15 minutes. I'm happy to take questions or remarks before wrapping up. But yeah, other than that, I'm pretty happy with finishing. Most people aren't aware of their narratives, so let's expose them. Yes, something like that. I think that's a large part of our job as teachers. I know Zephodius is also a teacher. Yeah. I think a large part of it is realizing what kind of stories people tell themselves, and evaluating from an outside perspective, like how helpful is this particular narrative for you. For the late in the chat, what's the definition of narrative? Basically the structure of this lecture was like, narrative is basically a story we tell ourselves. I mean, narratives are just stories. It's a synonym for stories. That sounds slightly cooler, but the idea is just that when we play Go, I observe that we think in terms of stories and not in terms of the moves, like, I don't know, a computer would. And that this is an interesting observation, and that we can use this observation to get better, and etc. Yeah, that's the TLDR. Yeah, thank you to everyone for watching. This was a fun one to do. I very much the topic very much clicked in my head when I thought of it. I was like, I really want to do this. I'm looking forward to doing this topic, and the preparation for the lecture like kind of made itself. Like, I had so many examples in mind that I wanted to share. Too many, obviously. So this was a fun one. Thank you very much for watching. I enjoyed it.